So today, in the gospel reading, St. Ephraim the Syrian said the following. He said, God was amazed at a human being. God was amazed at a human being. God, who created that human being, was amazed by his own creation. What a fantastic thing. He marveled at a human being. There are only actually 2 times in the whole New Testament where it says that Jesus marveled or was amazed. You could translate it either way. 2 times. The one time was at Nazareth, and there Jesus worked many miracles, and yet he marveled and was amazed at the people's disbelief. The fact that they witnessed all these miracles and authoritative teachings and yet continued to disbelieve, it amazed him. That's case number 1. Case number 2 is the gospel reading from today. This is the only of the 2 cases in which it was positive. Jesus marvels at the centurion's faith. So, to me, a red flag should go up. Our antenna should go up. Let's figure out what it is that the centurion did that amazed Jesus. Because, interestingly, the centurion was not a Jew. In fact, he was a member of the occupying Roman army that was hated by the Jewish people. Hated. And yet Jesus marvels at this man's faith. So, to look at the bigger context, where are we today? We're in Matthew chapter 8, starting at verse 5. In Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7 is the famous Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus gives the new law, the new Torah. The Sermon on the Mount is broken up really into 5 sections, which are meant to correspond to the 5 books of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. So Jesus preaches this incredible Sermon on the Mount, and then immediately following it in chapters 8 and 9 are 10 miracles. Jesus performs 10 miracles, which correspond to the 10 plagues that God sent against Egypt and Pharaoh and his hard heart in order to bring his people Israel out of bondage and slavery. And then he gave them the new law. Here, Jesus is giving them again a new law, and instead of 10 plagues, he's giving them 10 miracles in order to soften their heart and bring them out of this situation in which they had found themselves, in which they had fallen into a kind of a rut, that they were self-satisfied with their own religious practices and were no longer really dependent on God. They had taken over religion from God. They didn't really need God anymore. And when God sent his son, they ignored him. So that's the context. So the parable, the story that we read today is the second of those 10 miracle stories that come in Matthew chapter 8. So let's read this together. So it begins in verse 5. At that time, as Jesus entered Capernaum. Now, Capernaum was one of the centers of Jesus' ministry up in Galilee. And because it was located near the border, on the eastern border, and because it was along a major trade route, the Romans had a garrison of soldiers there. Probably they were mainly interested in making sure that they collected the taxes that were due to them through trade, but also because it was on the border, the Romans wanted to make sure they had an army there. So Jesus in Capernaum, in his home area, he had this detachment of Roman soldiers who were putting their thumb on top of the Jews, oppressing them, occupying their territory. So at that time, as Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him. Now, a centurion, as the name implies, centurion from century, meaning 100. A centurion was an officer who was in charge of approximately 100 soldiers. Now, we think by Jesus' time that the number was probably actually more like 80. But the idea was that the centurion was really the backbone of the Roman army. The centurion, I've heard different estimates about what it would correlate to in the U.S. military. But I've heard estimates something like a master sergeant or a second or first lieutenant or perhaps a captain. But in other words, it was this officer who was really in charge of the men on the ground. This was the man you went to in order to get things done in the army. Now, usually the centurions were ones that were not from the upper classes, and so higher officers. They rather worked their way up through the ranks and attained their position through competence, through discipline, and through excellence. So this is all something that the readers in the New Testament time in the first and second centuries, when they're hearing this story about Jesus' encounter with a centurion, they would know this. This would come into their mind. They would know this figure of the centurion because he was the leader of the local Roman army wherever they may have encountered them. Now, the other thing to remember about the Roman army was that the Roman army really set the stage for armies for the rest of history. The Roman army was something that wherever it went in the ancient world, it inspired awe and amazement due to its discipline. The Roman army was a model of discipline. And everyone in the ancient world marveled at this. Even if they hated the Romans, even if the Romans were coming to destroy them, they had to stop and marvel at the power of the Roman army that was achieved through discipline and through soldiers like the centurion. Now, soldiers like the centurion, he would have made a commitment to at least 20 years of service in the Roman army. And during that time, as he was committed to the army, he was not allowed to marry. He was fully committed to those who commanded him. He was fully committed to the Roman army. This was his sole focus in life, was the Roman army. In the story today, we'll see that he has a slave. So it wouldn't have been uncommon that he would have several slaves because he would probably be transferred around, moving around from different commands, and he would have with him slaves. He would make, the slave that he's talking about today would make perhaps something like 1/50th or 1/100th of the salary that the centurion commanded. So this was someone who, in the world's eyes, this slave was someone who was insignificant. So at that time, as Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, beseeching him and saying, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home in terrible distress." And Jesus said to him, "I will come and heal him." And actually, the Greek here could easily be translated as a question. Shall I come and heal him? It could be translated either way. In fact, probably it would be more likely that it was a question. Shall I come and heal him? Because in the ancient manuscripts, there were no spaces in between words and there was no punctuation. So you just had to know how to read this. But it would make sense that Jesus would be asking him, shall I come and heal him? Because here was a Roman soldier from the occupying army, a Gentile of all things, asking a Jew to come into his house. And this would have been considered defiling for the Jew. To go into an impure Gentile's house would make you defiled, and you would have to become ritually clean before you could participate in the temple services again. So a pious Jew would avoid this at all costs. And so perhaps Jesus is asking him, shall I come and heal him? Are you asking me to come and heal him? Perhaps out of surprise? We don't know. It doesn't really change the meaning, because the centurion answered him, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. But only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am a man under authority, with soldiers under me." So in other words, he means, I am under authority. He's placing himself in this system, in this hierarchy. And he knows his place. He knows his place. He is under authority. He is under officers who are above him, and under him are soldiers who take commands from him. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. And this is the extent of what the centurion says to Jesus. This is the extent. This is what Jesus marvels at. When Jesus heard him, he marveled and said to those who followed him, "Truly I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." This is what Jesus identifies as faith. The Sermon on the Mount that he had just given in chapters 5, 6, and 7, where he talked about the poor in spirit, this is where he found it. The centurion of all people, this Roman Gentile soldier, comes forward and shows that what Jesus had just been talking about in the Sermon on the Mount was indeed possible. Sometimes we read it and we say, this is impossible. No one can live up to this. And so Jesus has this centurion come and be an example to those who are following him and to us who are following him today. Here's what I'm talking about. This is a man who is poor in spirit. This is a man who understands who I am and why I'm here. Because the man understood that Jesus had authority. Like Jesus tells us at the end of Matthew 28, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. He has all authority. And it's only the centurion who recognizes this authority. And so Jesus marvels. The question now is this obedience, this sense of knowing that Jesus was over him, that Jesus was his authority, this centurion who brought such discipline, he recognized immediately where he fit in on this scale and that Jesus had all authority, even over sickness and corruption and death. He knew that Jesus had that authority, and he placed himself under Jesus' authority. He located himself correctly. What are the fruits of this kind of obedience? This kind of faith? One is humility. From antiquity, this confession of the centurion has formed the model for how we should approach Christ. How the centurion approached Christ is a model for how we should approach Christ. And this is why it is enshrined in the third prayer of St. John Chrysostom that we read before Holy Communion. Now these prayers before Holy Communion, we read just a small fraction of them together in church before we take communion. But there's actually many more prayers that we're supposed to read before we take communion, every time before we take communion, either the evening before and or the morning of, before we come to church. They're beautiful prayers that try to massage our soul, to try to get it ready to approach Christ in the way that the centurion approaches him. And what do we say at the beginning of this third prayer? Lord my God, I know that I am not worthy or sufficient, that you should come under the roof of the house of my soul. So the church from the earliest times has adopted this confession from the centurion and our own preparation as we come to approach Christ with this communion. St. Augustine comments on the centurion, by viewing himself as unworthy, he showed himself worthy for Christ to come, not merely into his house, but also into his heart. It was because of this humility, this acknowledgement that Jesus has authority over me. I am not the sole decider of what will happen. I am not God. This is the centurion's confession. I have those who are in authority over me spiritually. This gives us humility. This tamps down our pride. Not everything becomes about our whims and our desires. We follow with obedience Christ and his church. The second thing that this faith and obedience of the centurion produces is real love. Real love. Not the fake, superficial love of this world, but real love. Here was a man who was in charge of an entire area of an occupied territory. He had many concerns. He had 80 or 100 soldiers underneath him, and yet he was concerned for his slave boy. This is what the Greek word is, pes. He doesn't even use the word slave. It's this somehow more affectionate term, pes, his boy, his almost like his son. He uses this term, but it was his slave. He's concerned about his health. someone who had no status in the eyes of the world at that time. And this man, who you would think maybe would be a hard man after being in the army under those conditions. But his heart is soft because he has humility. And this leads to real love. So he takes the time to come to Jesus and ask him, please heal this slave boy of mine. This is real love, bringing this to Jesus. What we can do is we can bring this in prayer to Jesus. Our love, real love for other people. Bring that in prayer. And look at this slave boy. He says nothing in today's gospel, and yet he is probably the most blessed in the story today. He does nothing, but he's the beneficiary of someone who has put his trust in Jesus Christ, who has come under the authority of Jesus Christ, submitting himself with obedience to Jesus and asking humbly to heal this servant boy. This is real love. I'll conclude with this thought. I love this story of such humility before Christ. And yet, the centurion was still an officer. He still had men under his command. And so his was a real humility, not a fake kind of humility, a real humility. And what do I mean? I believe one time, I couldn't find the quote this week, but I remember reading one time St. Paisios, the modern saint of Greece, talking about humility. And he said, humility is knowing who you are. That was his definition of humility. Humility is knowing who you are. So the centurion today, look how he knew who he was. He knew that Jesus had authority over him and all creation. And he knew that he was not worthy for Jesus to come anywhere near him. That's how much lower that he was in comparison with Jesus. Jesus had full authority, and he recognized this. In the face of Christ, he has this humility. But at the same time, this doesn't lead to a false humility where he would lose the respect of his soldiers, because he still had a job to do. He knew where he was located in this society of people, in this system that amazed the whole world. He knew what his job was. His job was not to be the general. That was Jesus' job. His job, where he had been assigned, was to be a centurion and command those 80 men. And so his humility in the face of God did not negate his responsibility as a man of authority himself, who had soldiers under him. He knew who he was. He wasn't God, he was under him, but he also had a responsibility, not only to his soldiers, but to his slaves even. This is what this humility produces, the sense of responsibility for those under him, to love them, to serve them. This is what Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount. He who shall be last, first shall be last, to be a servant of all. So this man, he doesn't neglect his responsibility. He doesn't become irresponsible. He knows that he's still a centurion in command of men and in command of slaves. For those of us who are fathers, perhaps, I feel not worthy, not capable of doing this sometimes, but this is the job I've been assigned. I feel incapable of being a priest, but I know that at the ordination it said, the Holy Spirit will come upon you and complete what is lacking. And that God and the church ordained me for this role. God ordained me to be a father to my children. And so it would be false humility. It would be irresponsible for me to say, I can't do it. I'm not up to it. No, we can't do that. We have to take responsibility. But knowing that I am a man under authority. Jesus is above me, and I'm going to do what's been assigned to me. This is true humility, knowing who you are. In my person, I am the most unworthy, but in the position, I'm responsible. Acknowledging always that Jesus has the ultimate authority. Having this sense, knowing who we really are, that before God we are nothing, we are unworthy. We should fall down and plead with him. but at the same time knowing that he gives us strength to carry out what he has given us to do. This is true humility. This is how we should approach Christ, and this is the lesson we can learn from the centurion today. Amen.